Thanks a lot and welcome to Pax Europiana, our debate series about peace in Europe. I call it Pax Europiana, the strong Europe and the EU of 37 member states, including Ukraine, the Balkans, Georgia, Moldova. And now I would like to talk about EU sanctions against Russia. Actually, they are not against Russia or Russians, because the EU was very careful, and so were the NATO members and all the West, very careful to make targeted, reasonable, responsible, rational sanctions for the totally irresponsible and totally wrong attack on Ukraine, which Russia did, and the Russian leadership since 2014. I remember annexing Crimea, totally terrible, changing event which has tormented the whole European and global post-World War II order. It was really a momentous, terrible thing. Yeah? This is not easy just to occupy because you want something. If you do it like this leads to terrible global conflicts later on. So that was really totally wrong. And then, of course, to attack your neighboring country, not to say officially, but, to be there with military force significantly and support this Eastern Donbass war. This was Russia did very much, that is terrible. And, the EU sanctions were very justified for that one. And let's not forget, this is very important, and you will see, I will talk about it in this video as well, this shooting down of a civilian airline above Ukraine, MH17. This was a very, very terrible crime, killing over 300 innocent air passengers, with a Russian military tool, which only the Russian military can have, So please, these are really substantial criminal acts, with major consequences. Annexation of our countries, war in the neighboring countries, and the downing of a civil airplane. Imagine what we did when Gaddafi did it in Lockerbie and others, and at the PLO, these are really terrible crimes, So these sanctions are absolutely justified. So let me say this, because there's a website from the EU, you can read all the details about the sanction, and this video is not about the details of the sanctions. This video is about the debate how to lift the sanctions. Because is there a potential scenario where we could enter a certain kind of reducing of the sanctions, not abolish them at once? That's impossible because of all these terrible things Russia did since 2014. But, there is this debate now because, the Southern Europeans, anyhow, they were never really understanding what's going on. They like Russian tourists and Russian money, and they have a traditional misunderstanding what is Eastern Europe, see them a little bit of competition on the labor market, and are not very, in European debates of responsibility, unfortunately. Excuse my French, but if we would do foreign policy like the Spanish, who have not even recognized Kosovo to their big shame and only think about Catalonia, that's the only thing they can really think about, and the Italians, really, they have not had any kind of good foreign policy decision in the last 150 years, excuse my French, and the Greeks, that's not the way we can do it, and please don't get angry with me, but these are not really responsible foreign policy actors and have never been, and luckily they are firmly in the Western context of NATO and EU. So the French are a little bit different, obviously. We have, of course, a debate now about lifting sanctions. The French have gone for appeasement, think it's attractive, and so on. So this debate is there. And, it was mainly also the Northern Europeans, Germany, the Eastern Europeans, and also, not Hungary, of course, but the Northern Eastern Europeans, who were already very strict on that one, and that was very justified, as I've said. Of course, America as well. So please let me understand and let me make the case. If anybody, and there is also, from the business sector, from the left populist, from the right populist, there is also in Central Europe a debate about lifting sanctions, under which scenario sanctions could be reduced in a kind of EU internal, Western internal bargain. Look, my thinking is this can only happen in a context where, first of all, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova are granted the possibility to float the euro, get EU potential candidate status, and also the membership action plan for NATO, and a very clear timeline, as I have outlined in the videos before, for NATO membership of the three parts: free Moldova, free Ukraine, free Georgia. That means without the occupied territories, the 5 occupied territories which Russia holds at the moment, Transnistria, Crimea, Eastern Donbass, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So without these, of course, they cannot join NATO. But, we have many precedences like France without Algeria, and we have Germany without the GDR. So absolutely, that's already dealt with as a precedent. Yeah? So how can I envision a kind of compromise between the countries who want to sustain the sanctions, which are very justified? And, but also, there could be the case made if now with Corona we need economic, and we have something to give, and something to take. A deal could, like in politics, often you have less perfect solutions, but you help concretely a lot of people. And maybe there is a way. And the way I say is, we could enter a corridor of reducing the sanctions against Russia for all the 3 major crimes it did, and of course Georgian violence included and all the other things. We could enter such a kind of a corridor of reducing the sanctions, at the same time securing Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia inside the West. So then they would be secured by NATO membership, they would be prosperous by the euro as a firm fundament for their economic development, and also as a very clear, immediate, visible signal for the population and for everybody else where they belong to Europe, by using the euro in Ukraine, in Georgia and in Moldova. And, then also with 10 years project 29, I say, for Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia to join the European Union. Of course, they need to make their regulatory reforms, but much of them they have already started, and much is already going on. So in that scenario, when, for example, the Italians and Spanish and Portuguese and the Greeks agree on this encouragement of euro adoption and granting EU potential candidate status, the French and Germans end their blockade of NATO membership of Ukraine, also ready for Article 5 guarantee for Ukraine's demarcation line, and also the same in Georgia. And, then, okay, let's reduce the sanctions, because we obviously want then to find some agreement with Russia as well, because it's probably difficult for Russia to find this new reality. And so then obviously with reducing the sanctions, then Putin has something to sell as well to his population, as the sanctions have been reduced. They cannot be completely cancelled, because imagine, there is also this legal investigation, the criminal investigation for the crime of shooting down a civilian airline. And this is very important in this context, because there might be some historic case for anything in Europe when it comes to land. Austria could take half of Central Europe again on the same basis like Russia justified the Crimean annexation. But what I think nobody will agree that it is good to shoot down civilian airplaners over Europe. And this is ultimately, you can always discuss, who gave the final order for what. But that this is a military instrument which nobody privately can buy on the bazaar is quite obvious. And this is a Russian military state important rocket, the Buk. You cannot just, take it from your home and transport it somewhere and shoot around and make some experiment. Somebody gave the order for this instrument to be in this Russian occupied zone of Ukraine in Eastern Donbass. Somebody gave the order to shoot. Somebody in the military. And the legal situation, what really is established, you can follow on Bellingcat and on the proceedings in Denmark. no, in the Netherlands, sorry. But this is all very serious, because ultimately it will lead to a criminal investigation against the Russian state headed by Putin. So an escalation on that is unavoidable. So I ask myself, and I ask everybody who is interested, is it not much better to somehow find a settlement on all these very complicated issues, which will very, very controversial be very, very soon, yeah? And then try to maybe find an accommodation with Russia, which basically involves our granting of, encouraging of the Eurozone towards Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, at the same time granting the status of potential EU candidate status and map to NATO for these three countries, and somehow make sure that the three countries are in this time frame of 24 in NATO, not 29, and at the same time maybe find difficult but somehow modus vivendi with Russia in that same way, without somehow letting these processes slide towards a really full-scale confrontation maybe by 24, and convince also Putin that his responsibility will be a big issue. So maybe to somehow find this settlement, which always from the European side has to include the potential EU candidate status, the NATO map and membership of Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and as a fast-track instrument, which we can do within 6 months, to float the euro in all three countries. And then somehow we enter into a corridor where there will be, everybody will criticize such an arrangement as a deal, yeah? But it's a deal which is very good for 44 million Eastern Europeans to be in the West. Yeah? This is justified morally. Yeah? There will be, of course, we can do little for the Crimean friends and for the people in Eastern Donbass who decide to stay, but calling them to come to free Ukraine, yeah? That's what we can do. But that's what they should do. But for the people who decide to live in these occupied territories, we can do little until Russia voluntarily gives up this region, because Reconquista nobody will do that. And the whole situation cannot be settled militarily, politically we tried. We will never recognize such. That should not be included, recognition of any of the conquests of Russia. No. But we can somehow find a modus vivendi where we live for decades with that one. And, time will come. Maybe like with Saxonia and Thuringia, time came. It took 45 years or 28 years after the building of the wall. Look, that is all very tragic, but hard to change. That's the reality of power politics. But we can help very much the 44 million free Ukrainians, free Georgians, and free Moldovans with that. Their life will be completely transformed positively in the next decade if they have the euro, if they are secured by NATO, and if they are inside the European Union. And when Russia then somehow finds a way to accept that reality as well and somehow de-escalates, then they can focus on developing their conquests, unrecognized, like Abkhazia and Ossetia, and see how they like that. And we will ask them in the 2030s again what's happening. But we could avoid further escalations. And further escalations, given the immensity of the crimes of Russia in the MH17 and the direct line of responsibility, that will be coming, and it's unavoidable. So, in a sense, trying to find accommodation makes a lot of sense, but it has always to include the free, ultimate, very important, very justified and morally reasonable and economically very sound decisions to grant the euro to Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and have the invitation to join NATO and EU clearly endorsed by European Council and by a NATO leaders meeting, and then to implement it in this decade. And that's of course also not easy as it was, and I have made many slides and videos already. It was not easy with the BRD. You know, Adenauer was criticized, you know. We need also leadership then in Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia to explain that and justify that and make it understood. The kind of Adenauer qualities we need in these countries. But we need also a leader of the free world in Washington, in the White House, who is able to make that. But what is not possible, and that I make very clear, and will be my statement on the sanctions, what we cannot do is lifting sanctions and giving up on Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova and letting them in the nirvana of the East somewhere, somehow by powerful forces being destroyed between the West and the East, and giving up on Ukraine, Moldova and Georgians. That would be really very, very wrong. And I'm convinced nobody in the European Council or in the NATO leadership will really seriously consider just lifting sanctions by Corona or whatever. There will be no lifting of sanctions for the very long term. And the only way to do it is maybe to work in such a line that the future of Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova is not maybe theoretically secured, but directly secured by the euro, using the euro in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova as the first step, because that can be very much done within 6 months. It's just the electronic, basically shifting. The payment systems are ready. You know, everybody who lives in Ukraine can pay in euro already by the credit card. So the underlying technical situation is there, and the visibility and the courage. It of course needs consent from the central bank and, you know, from some euro member countries at least, and do that and make it very clear, and then obviously also support Ukraine in the defense of the demarcation lines towards Crimea and towards Donbass. And then we have 3 new EU and NATO members in this decade, and we have also clarified our relation with Russia in the extent possible. That's what we need to do if we consider to going down in this difficult way. If we just leave everything like it is, it will get much more difficult as well in 21, 22, 23, because the crisis in Russia will accelerate, and, you know, the sanctions will stay, and, you know, the topic who is responsible will accumulate in a kind of a narrative against the West, and our situation with Russia won't be much easier by just delaying and not doing anything. So the proposal I make, going in a corridor of reducing the sanctions in exchange for a NATO and EU membership of the 3 countries which are under Russian attack, is a much more reasonable and peaceful corridor of a settlement than any other proposals I up to now have heard. Thanks a lot. For Pax Europiana.